All right. Well, thanks everyone for having me here. The first slide here we've got is Azure Bicep. And as was alluded to earlier, it's Azure Bicep. I'll get more into the history of it, but it's kind of an extension of ARM, and that's kind of where the name came from, is my understanding. I couldn't think of anything better to put in there for a pun, but you can leave that to your own imagination. So first off, a little bit about myself. I am a senior DevOps consultant at OST, based out of Grand Rapids. However, up until August, I was out of Omaha for the past decade. So seen some of the names around, taught a couple classes at Metro. So familiar with the area there. I got some ways you can find me there, some certifications I have to kind of help blend some expertise to the topic. Blog, if you want to check, there's a couple things out there on Bicep. The other big one right now seems to be YAML templates. So that's another one I've been covering a lot of. And then I'm new to Twitter, so don't be too harsh on me on that one. But go ahead and feel free to reach out to me on any of those platforms. So first off, Azure Bicep, what is it? The intent is to simplify the Azure Resource Manager, that ARM template experience. I think if you look at it as a whole, it's not. It could be a lot more developer friendly. ARM templates could be, right. It feels at times more like a config than a programming language. So Azure Biceps to help supplement that experience and kind of blend a little bit more to that programmer experience. It also can be a little bit Terraformish, I'll call it. If you're not familiar with Terraform can deploy Azure, AWS resources and whatnot, but there's the concepts of modules or compartments, and it feels a little bit more like code, but it's known as a state file, but I won't get into that. The other thing is right now it still is listed as experimental, but they do have that on the roadmap to move it out of that stage. And I just copy and paste this from the Azure Bicep page, which is out on GitHub, by the way. But bunch of wording there if you want to read it, that their official stance is. Basically, we're not replacing ARM. We're just over top of ARM, creating ARM templates as the language. From my experience, it is a little helpful. We'll get into that and shortly. So then I move to the next slide here. Kind of the timeline on this programming language. I think there are rumors about this probably early last year that it was coming out, but V1 was initially released in September. V2 was in November. And along with V2, there was, or .2, I should say, there was the VS Code extension, introduction of modules, as well as being able to deploy to different scopes. In addition to, in fact, this just came out, I want to say like 3 weeks ago, they introduced some conditional formatting and some resource group locks you can deploy as well. The other call out I have on there is that version .3 is supposed to be covered by Azure support plans, which I thought was interesting. Originally, I think that ETA is the end of this month. I'm not 100% sure. I will say it is a very active code base. Raising issues, commits, you hear back easily within a day, sometimes within an hour. So it's something that's very active. With that being said, my intent here is to kind of walk everyone through how to create a Bicep file, how to deploy it, all those pieces of it. If you feel more than welcome to pull up VS Code and we can kind of walk through it. I'm going to try to talk at all levels of it. I know the guidelines say don't interrupt with talks and whatnot, but I'm going to try to keep the chat up because I always struggle when someone does something new. Everything's already pre-configured by the time you log in, right? So you kind of get lost. I'm going to start from a brand new VM. So if you have any questions, feel free to post. We'll set everything up from scratch. Even we'll do a basic example and then I'll go ahead and walk through a more complex one. But if you want to play around, because I know sometimes if these sessions, right, it's okay, I'm just going to go and you ask questions about it, right? Feel free to reach out. That's kind of what I'm here for, to help with some of this stuff. So with that being said, let's move on to what the meat of this presentation really is. So as alluded to, I've got brand new VM. The only thing on this VM I put on is VS Code, and that was really to save time. I actually thought about just doing that part as well, but I figured we can do a little bit of the legwork. So the first thing, as I alluded to in the history, there is an extension out here. So if you want to go ahead and click install on it. And what this extension will do is it'll help, as it says here, some of the IntelliSense and some of the configuration. So with that being said, I think that's already installed. I beefed up the VM a little bit. So now I've got this extension installed. the next thing to do is let's go ahead here and just create a folder that we'll throw some stuff into. Oh, would help if I create the folder. All right, and select that. So I'm in my Bicep folder here, and one of the prereqs too, and it's in the documentation a little bit, but you also, to really compile it, you need to have the Bicep CLI. So one thing I want to do here, if this loads, is check the version of Bicep on this machine, and as expected, it doesn't recognize that command. So in order to really work with Bicep files, we've got the VS Code extension, but we still, to really do much with compilation of files, we still need to download the CLI piece of it. And I'm gonna copy some instructions here into the chat for those that are on a Mac. I'm not on a Mac, to be fair to you. I haven't tried this, so this is just straight from their Git repository. But if you're on a Windows, I'm gonna send the link here to download. So that way it saves people time from hunting and pecking. So there's that. And I'll do the same since this machine doesn't have it. And don't be alarmed, there should be a pop-up here. Yep. So like I said, don't get alarmed, hit more info. Again, this is experimental. Hit run anyway. So kind of odd, right? We got a Microsoft product and Windows isn't trusting it, but let that run here. All right. And now we go ahead and do Bicep version again. It failed. Don't be alarmed. This is expected, right? We've installed a new CLI component here. We've got a relaunch PowerShell module, which is the easiest way I find is just to restart Visual Studio Code. I do believe there is a command, but I don't know it off the top of my head. So now that I'm in here, if I do Bicep version, there we go. One thing too, with any good CLI tool, the help command's available. So if you get sidetracked on it, feel free to go ahead and put that in if you feel lost at times. But this one's pretty easy. Sometimes I try to put some knowledge when I can. So now that the station's kind of set up, the first thing to do is create a file. And I'm just going to name it something simple. Just do main.bicep. It is the .bicep is the extension for that file. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat to make sure.
Hey, John.
Yes.
The steps that you have sent there on the chat is the same as downloading that exe? Or...
the last one is the URL. The steps there is for Mac.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, like I said, I haven't tried it on Mac. That's just how they've documented it. And
I'm on Mac. I'm trying to verify that for you now.
Oh, okay. I appreciate that.
So Mac users can basically follow those steps, and if anyone is on Windows, can just download that exe.
That is correct.
Awesome.
So, all right. So now, if everyone's taking a minute to get things set up, and I misspelled my file, let's rename that the correct way. So main.bicep. So traditionally, with the ARM template, you've got the sections as to what's going to be my YAML schema, what's going to be the parameters, the variables, and the resources. Well, in Bicep, and this is going to feel more familiar to those that are experienced with Terraform, you just call out resource, and then you give this resource any name. And what I'm going to do here, what we'll do is a storage account. I always find Azure storage accounts are the easiest walk-through things because one, they're simple, and two, if you forget to delete them, they're really cheap. So I'm just going to call this examples storage, and that's going to be the name of this resource. And by the name, that's going to be the name we're going to use to reference it throughout. So it's not going to be the actual name of the resource, but if we refer to it, we'll refer to it as example storage. So after defining that, you define what is going to be the type is an ARM, right? The resource type. You define that here. In our case, we do Microsoft.storage. And you can see here in the IntelliSense, it's already pulling away all the different types of APIs available. We'll go ahead and we'll grab the latest one. You can click that. And then we'll do equal. So think of it as we're defining this resource, this example storage of this type. Now let's go ahead and actually define more of the characteristics we'd see in our traditional storage account. So first off, if you play around with Azure, you know the two things everything's going to require is a name and a location. So for the name and for storage accounts, everything has to be lowercase and no numbers, and also globally unique. I'm just going to say Omaha Azure. Oh, let me preference it. I do SA in front of everything, but Omaha Azure, and then I'll define this region EUS. That's going to be the name of this storage account. And then define our location, which I'm going to do East US because that's what's closest to me. For Omaha, probably Central US. And if you're somewhere else, pick whatever location's closest to you. The next thing we're going to do for a storage account is you need to define the kind. And FYI too, I do have notes. I don't know all this from memory, so don't worry if it's kind of like, well, I don't know these type of things. Comes with cheat sheets. So after the kind, you got to call the SKU. And what the SKU will do is just tell it to be basically how many times do we want to replicate this? Well, you can just do standard locally redundant storage. So, all right, let me give a minute here to let everyone catch up and we can recap this. But essentially, this is all that's required to define a storage account in Bicep and build one. You see that it's got the name, we're calling it example storage. Here's the endpoint type, the API version, the name, location, kind, SKU, basically the properties. One thing too to keep in mind too is since Bicep's over top of ARM, in theory, everything you can do in ARM, you can do in Bicep. So, all right, that being said, now that I've got this Bicep file, what do I do with it? Well, the command is Bicep build and pass in the file name, main.bicep. So if I do that, notice now I got a main.json. So if I click over to it, well, what happened? First off, if you know ARM, you're like, okay, this looks like an empty ARM template. You're right. The reason why nothing got populated is I didn't save. So you have to save it before you build it. If you do things in Terraform, that's pretty standard when you're doing items like that. So let me now, after I saved it, up key, by the way, you can repeat the command if you're not familiar with a PowerShell terminal. Go ahead and hit that enter key again. And if I go into it, it built out an ARM template. If you are familiar with ARM, this looks pretty familiar. This shouldn't be scary. It's like, okay, big whoop right now, kind of, it doesn't look much of a difference between these two, but let's start expanding things a little bit, all right? So a lot of times with ARM templates, you want to do certain things where in general programming, parameters, variables, those kind of things. So let's go ahead and try adding some. So in Bicep, a parameter is defined by just param, and you give it a name. I'm going to give it location because that's a pretty common one to parameterize for an ARM template. And then we call the type. In our case, it'll be string equal to, and I could just do East US. However, a lot of times the best practice is to keep things together in the same region as the resource group, just so that it appears more as a geo-central unit. So to do that, I can just do resource group dot location. Okay. So if you've done ARM before, you know that this would be like 4 lines of code. We can do it here in 1. The other thing too is the parameters can be initialized anywhere in the Bicep file. So in ARM, they always have to be up in the param, the first section of the file. So that's kind of nice. So another one, just to keep up with this, I'm going to do that. Just an app name. That's something that I kind of do that's generic. So string equals, and I'm going to go ahead and say, let's grab, and we'll do the region. I normally don't like to auto determine that, but for simplicity, we'll do that. So now I've got two parameters, and one of the things that with ARM templates, it's kind of a good idea to do is you take this base name and you can adhere a naming standard to it. So in our case, we'd probably adhere the SA to denote storage account. So to do that, that would be done as a variable. So let's do var, and I'm just going to call this storage account name equals, we'll go ahead and do our string SA, that's what we're going to preface it with. Then it's $ curly brace to go ahead and escape that and reference it. In this case, we'll do app name. So this should also, if you're familiar with Terraform, this is pretty similar. This follows the same type of logic on it. So I'm just going to save that now. So now I've got these defined. How do I use them? So for the name here, I'm just going to simply type storage account name. IntelliSense is right there and gave it to me. Location, I'll go ahead and do that too. And if you've done things with ARM, this should be a kind of a breath of fresh air a little bit, because if ARM, you have to do parameters dot, then that, you have to do the square brackets too to escape and all that. Here it's pretty simple. Let me go ahead and save this. And now if I rebuild this and check this out, now this is starting to look more like a little bit of a robust ARM template. And now if I were to go back and forth, you start to see how this kind of streamlines it potentially. 13 lines to 30 lines, and this is a simple storage account. I'm going to take a minute here and see if there's anything in the chat. Okay, so now that we've got all this, the question becomes, how do we go ahead and potentially, if we want to deploy this? So I'm going to try stepping through, because at this point, if you're really familiar with ARM templates, this is like, okay, so now I got something that's deployed, I'd put this through my process and whatnot. But I'm going to assume that we're not doing that right now, or that you may not have that. So we'll jump in and kind of deploy this potentially through Azure CLI, and I'll step you through what that kind of looks like. So again, if you're familiar with Azure, this may feel a little redundant, so feel free, if you want to ask questions or experiment, you can. We will get into more of the advanced topics on Bicep here once I show how to deploy it. So if you're unfamiliar, you do AZ login, and this fails. It's not a surprise again, because it's a new VM, doesn't have the Azure CLI tools on it. So I will drop that install link here as well, and I'll install the CLI tools. And this one, it's the same link, you just choose your version. So we'll do Windows. And I'll do current release. If you did do AZ login, you do have the tools, you'll have a prompt for the browser, which is fine. If you want to log in, I'll show what that looks like here once this completes. Some of the other things while we're waiting, just to kind of explain too, if the language is one of the things Bicep, and I'll show in the examples too, can do for you is it automatically determines dependencies. So while I'm waiting here, so if I do have, well, that's one of the big things of ARM templates, is the bigger the ARM template, you have to keep track of all the dependencies. Well, in Bicep, if you were to go ahead and say, if I'm going to reference this and do something like example, it may not be because I'm not in there, but you can do the name dot, and let's say resource dot ID would be the Azure resource ID. Well, Bicep will automatically say, okay, I need to compile this before that other resource that uses the ID or references it, similar to what Terraform does. All right, there we go. And then just like last time, I'll close And relaunch Visual Studio Code. And do my AZ login. And this should eventually pop up here in my browser. Here we go. And I'll sign into my account. And my organization has MFA, so give me 1 second here. And I got a feeling this may not be working right now for me. I had an issue with this earlier. So let me try one more time. Oh, okay. Control C, by the way, will go ahead and terminate that if you're ever stuck. And there we go. So I don't know what happened there. So now this will pull up all the subscriptions I have. I'm going to go to a lab one I have, but for most folks, I would recommend, you probably have a Visual Studio Professional subscription that you can go ahead and do that with. You'll see the whole list of them here. And then we'll do this by going AZ account, set subscription. In my case, I'm going to do this lab environment that I have access to. Odds are most folks are going to have a visual, like mine actually got disabled. That's why I'm not doing mine, because it happened earlier this week actually. But there should be a Visual Studio Professional subscription. Most folks have that with their MSDN. So if I do that, and again, just to kind of show what's out there with the CLI, this will give you all the options you have or commands you have underneath that account. So I'm going to do AZ account show. This shows that that's the environment I'm hooked up to. So now that we've got this ARM template, what you need to do is with deployments, you deploy at the resource group level, right? So let's go ahead and create a resource group. And to do that, it's going to be AZ, the command there, and then group create will be the verb we'll use, /n or -n will be the name. And I always do RG, but in this case I'll do Bicep, Omaha Bicep demo, that works good. Then I always do an environment dev and then a region EUS. And then the second piece that needs to be passed in is a location. Again, everything in Azure needs a name and a location. East US, let me put that in quotes just to be sure. Don't know if that's needed or not. Ta-da, this comes back and says, yep, you got this create resource group that's out there. If we want to go out to the Azure portal, I can confirm that. What I call RG Omaha. May not be in the portal yet. Okay, it's there. So we'll check on that in a minute once we do the next deployment. So now that we've done that, next we have to do is run a deployment of our JSON file, the ARM template. So to do that, we'll go ahead and do that by doing a AZ deployment group create. F is for the file name, our main.json. This should be the JSON file, not the Bicep file. Again, think of Bicep as help creates the JSON file. You don't deploy Bicep directly. And then you have to pass in the resource group name, which in our case, or my case, it was RG Omaha Bicep demo dev EUS. It's whatever you decide is what was in there before. If I go ahead and hit this, well, it would help if I could spell. Spelling was never my strong suit. All right, and while that's running, what I'll pull up here, let's see if this is in there yet. Okay, so my resource group's now in there. Sometimes if you do things in the CLI, it takes a while to appear in the portal. A lot of times people ask, if I hit that deploy button and then I exit, can I quit it? No. You can see I hit deployments, it's deploying. I gave it that name main, right? And I can go ahead here and see the ARM template if I wanted to. But you can see there it's spinning up the storage account. It might actually be done. It is. So there's our storage account, and that's via the ARM template. So now everyone should, at this stage, everyone would have taken a Bicep file and then created the ARM file for that, and now has deployed it. So you kind of see that cradle to grave, how to set up things and use Bicep from an introductory level. I do want to show just a trick or two of some of the different things you can do in the language. It's kind of cool and interesting. What I'll start with here in VS Code, we'll create a new folder. I'm just going to call this folder decompile. And what I'd like everyone to do is, if you copy this copy the ARM template, just go ahead and copy that and put that in the decompile file. And now here in our command prompt, I'm going to say cd for change directory to decompile. So now that we're there, one thing I want to do here is now do Bicep. And let's go back to that help command. And if you notice, there is a build's the only thing it really does, is the big one, but there's also this one here, which takes Bicep file, or an ARM template rather, and creates a Bicep file out of it. So it's almost a backwards compatibility, which is kind of interesting to see out there. So if we try that now and say Bicep decompile and do our main.json, warning, everything's experimental with this language. I'll tell you that that's true and you'll run into that. But now if I go here, and because we kind of cheated, right? We used Bicep to build the JSON, and now we did the JSON to build the Bicep. They're identical. So you can reverse engineer an existing ARM template into a Bicep file, which is pretty slick. Again, I think one of the questions that you take away from that is saying, if you're providing that type of functionality, then you're really wanting to drive adoption, is what I see on that, or potentially a convergence of things. I'm not quite sure where that resides in the roadmap, but it's kind of interesting to see that functionality out there. I will now dive a little bit. This is it that I have for a walkthrough on hands-on things. I'm going to dive a little bit into some of the more advanced things in Bicep. And this is stuff actually that I've all created and I've contributed out to the Bicep project. So you can go out there, it's publicly navigatable. But by the way, let me go ahead and show this. So this is just out on GitHub. You can see it's Azure Bicep. This is what I dragged literally and put in that PowerPoint, what it is, right? Calls out some of the goals. There's a lot of stuff in here. The one thing that I decided to try to do first with this is, if you're unfamiliar, there's a breaking change coming in Application Insights, as in you're going to have to require a log analytics workspace with new versions of Application Insights on the API end. So I noticed that a little while ago, and I started and put in a quick start to kind of how to do that. Well, from there I said, okay, well, what would this look like in Bicep? So just to show an example, they've got a Bicep playground out there with some samples in there. And this is the sample of that ARM template that I submitted to Quick Starts as a Bicep file. And I went ahead and did all this. And this is a little bit more advanced, and just to kind of step through, hopefully you can start to see some of the differences. Here on the right is the ARM template. On the left is the Bicep file. So you see some of the things we did with parameters is there, variables, doing some of the naming abbreviations, that's all there. In this example, at a high level, to what I was talking about with that, it's a web stack. So you need an app service plan, which would be your traditional, I would call it IIS box. Then you need an app service, which would be your traditional site. The application insights associated with that, with the logging, then the log analytics to where to send the logs to at a high level. But over here, you see I've called out all those different components here, and they're all named, right? We called ours example storage, but you can see this is named app service logging, app service, with those pieces of it. But where you start to see some of the more advanced functionality is here. I'd call out the app service plan.id, because again, you can't have an app service without an app service plan. So if I reference that server farm ID, which is what the ARM value would be to kind of say this is where I put my resource ID, if I reference it via the resource.id, it will take it. And then here, to show you what that looks like on the ARM side of things, this is what it looks like on the ARM side. But also, it's on the developer to go ahead and put in the depends on. But by doing it this way, it'll automatically populate those depends on for you. So in these more advanced templates, it starts to kind of really be beneficial to do some of this. In this example, there's a couple places where that kind of work happens. The one thing I will say, if you are new, to take a moment and think about though, is yeah, I could easily go ahead and get the resource ID without referencing this name. Or some of the other properties you can get, like if I want to do, let me see if I can find one here. I think there's one in here. Maybe there isn't, but you just gotta be careful that you want to reference it based upon the name that you've given it in here and not the name that might exist in Azure, because again, it doesn't know about it. So by referencing it that way, it knows about it, knows the depends on, does the linkage. The next topic that I kind of want to dive into on this one is, and I'm going to pull up my local Visual Studio Code now, is the modules. So the modules, they're not supported yet in that playground I showed you, because the playground really is like a one-to-one file representation. But a module at a high level, if you're familiar with Terraform, that should be pretty usual for you. But if you took that file I showed and said, okay, if we create a separate file for the app service plan, a separate file for the app service, and then compile it all into one, how does that work? And you can hopefully see the use case in doing that is by doing that in a module format, you can reuse that module rather than have to redeclare it every time in your ARM template. So what that looks like, and I got this out here, and this is all out, like I said, out on the Bicep project. You have the main Bicep file, and that main Bicep file is going to go ahead here, and the module gets defined, give that module reference a name, and then I'm telling it where that Bicep file is, and then I'm giving the name of the actual compilation there, and then the params that I want to pass into it. So one thing, and I'll pull this into it, that's a little bit tricky with the modules is in this example, if, like I know my app service is going to use an app service plan ID. Well, I have to go back to this app service plan module, this definition, and define the outputs. I can't use this if it isn't defined as an output of the module. So if I go to that module, the app service plan, and you can see here I've defined the output. But you start to see, and I'm going to jump in here to see if anyone's got any questions. You start to see where you start compartmentalizing some of this stuff and it starts to break out. It can scale out really fast. As in some stuff, you start having lots and lots of files. But if you start thinking from a reusability perspective, there's some potential there on that. But in this case, you can see that I've broken it down to everything's got its own module. So a good example in this one is the app service plan. Like let's say that if you have an app service plan, right, you can have multiple app services tied to that. Well, when doing deployments now, I could just go ahead and reference the module and bring in that information rather than redefine it every time. So that's where some of the pros come on that one. The other thing that I'll go to on the next topic with Bicep that's still new, and again, this is another one that's out there and committed, is conditionally building. Oh wait, before I do that, let me show what that ARM template actually looks like, because there might be some confusing on what when doing those modules, what the actual ARM might look like. So what the ARM will look like is it's actually going to go ahead and do, what's it called? Linked deployments is what it's doing. So it's loading in each one of these as its own separate deployment. So that's really what it's doing. That's the magic behind the scenes on that one. So if you aren't familiar with that and what's going on, that's really what it's doing. But let me go back now to conditionally. So conditions, think of them, they have them in ARM, right? If I say if this, do this. But where this kind of, I took it to the next level here is, and this using that same one, but different architecture. So let me give a minute to let that set in. the web components and the logging components. So for whatever reason, let's say I can choose if I want to deploy that log analytics, the application insights, all those dependencies. I can choose that by just putting if and then checking my Boolean operator, and that's it. So it'll go through and conditionally load that associated module for deployment. But you can do that on any property type of stuff. I just thought it was kind of cool to kind of do that at a module level or on the actual resource level, because you can do that in ARM, but it's nowhere near as simple as this. But you can do it pretty easily in Bicep. So did that. Let me go ahead and take a break there and see if anyone's got any questions or comments on it. Okay.
Hey John, I'm trying to follow what you are trying to show here, and one thing I'd like to hear is the spelling fixer. If you type it wrong, it will tell you that you should correct it. Did you try that? If you'll go
You're
ahead
talking
and
about, let me jump back here. Or,
in your Bicep file, if you'll go ahead and by mistake, if you type something wrong, let's say, it will tell you if it's a keyword, it will tell you that this is, you should correct the name.
So like in here, you're saying if I do something like this?
Not like this. What I was doing was I was typing resource group. So if we'll go ahead and change resource group or any existing keywords in it.
So like one of these?
Mm-hmm. Not like that. I mean, if you, there is, I
got
just
it.
got a one word letter C. So
like
if you'll, yeah.
And
not go to that resource group dot location. It should give it to you there.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So like if I go into here and do location and I don't think this is a great example.
But if you'll, this one, if you will change location, I think that's where it will give you error.
Oh, okay. So if I did,
let's say,
like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, I didn't know that one.
Did you mean location?
Yeah. That's kind of cool.
And then that's quick fixes that. Just go.
Yeah, I mean, some of the IntelliSense is kind of where I found a lot of the stuff to do, like what's defined in there. A couple of the downsides I have seen, it's kind of funny if you follow the issues log with the IntelliSense, it relies, and this is actually a good example, it can't find all the types on some of this stuff because the way that the Azure teams have done things, they've done different naming standards on their endpoints. And there was one too where there's like a spelling mistake, which is kind of odd, but it's also kind of interesting to see the issues get raised in Bicep and then they go to the product teams directly. So that's been kind of fun to see. So if I were to go out here again, you can see here they've got some of the issues, like the one I was talking about here, they have missing type invalidation inaccuracies. So if you go out here, it just keeps a list of everything that's off, and they're opening up tickets that are in the associated project teams, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So I kind of went a little faster than I anticipated. I do have another slide here, but kind of talking about from the Bicep perspective, it really starts to make infrastructure as code feel more like code, I'd say. Like you start seeing some more reusability. It's less config and more code, I'd say. Again, I kind of alluded to anything that's supported in ARM is 100% supported in Bicep from day one. I put in theory because you assume that the endpoints and the validations are correct. But even if they aren't, you're just getting a warning message. You're not getting a hard error. It's just saying I can't validate it, but if I build it and it creates the ARM template, it's still going to deploy the ARM template. So that still works. The one other thing too is, and I think when people hear about this, they start saying, oh, this is going to replace ARM or this will be the next generation of ARM. I don't think that's the case. I think it's to help drive adoption maybe some more. If you think about with ARM, I don't think that's going to be replaced overnight because things like Data Factory, Logic Apps, all those UI designers build ARM in the background. So it's not like it's going to go anywhere. Again, too, it feels like it's in Microsoft's plans and it's in the future there. Like it's definitely putting some effort to it. I'm just not sure where that integration or that implementation is going to lie. So again, any questions, comments? Man, I thought I was going to take a full hour and it took more like 40 minutes. So we got some time.
I don't see anything on the chat, but anyone in the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and
hey,
ask John.
This looks really pretty cool. My question is, as you kind of build up these libraries and when you're putting them in source control and things, would you normally keep the JSON files in source control too that it generates, or would we just keep kind of the Bicep files in there and then have a build process generate them?
So good question. And that's been brought up as some of the issues. In fact, it's ironic you brought that up because I just saw this today in here. Let me see if I can find it. There's a documentation they added to about CI/CD. And I believe, if I remember right, it's the Bicep file. And as part of that process, the Bicep will compile on the server, create the ARM template, and then deploy that ARM template, which now that I say out loud about that, that might work for dev, but you probably want to have a manual intervention after the ARM's compiled, kind of like in Terraform, to make sure it looks right. But let me see if I can find that real fast. Here we go. So build and then deploy.
I think till that time we can build it and we can install Bicep on the build server or the build agent for Azure DevOps. I think we should be able to build it.
So interesting on this too is I saw this, and this is again where I think it's in Microsoft's play, because right here I think it's pre-installed. Oh no, it's not.
Not,
okay.
Yeah.
So I misread that earlier, but yeah. But this kind of tells you what their thoughts are on that, because I've had that thing too, because yeah, I did everything locally, but how does that look at an enterprise level?
Oh.
And I don't think they're there yet. They haven't even thought too much about that.
That decompile feature looked really cool too. Really helpful.
Yeah.
At least my first take on that is it looks so cleaner than an ARM template, though. At least.
Yeah. Some of the other feedback I've gotten on this is this going to, like, you have the developer folks and you also have infrastructure folks, and it feels like I feel like it's for two different audiences, right? ARM's going to go more, I think, for infrastructure, and this may go more for development folks, just because they are different.
I just wonder still, the question will be, should we go with Terraform or should we go with Bicep?
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation.
I mean, Terraform, in my opinion, will still score because that gives you that multi-cloud support. But I'm not sure what's the plan for Bicep, but if you are a single shop, you are working on Azure, I guess this looks so much better than working on ARM templates.
Yeah, the concern I have with Terraform is just the managing of a state file. Like, that can be good or bad. It can be good because it's always going to wipe out what you don't want or what's not defined, but then you have locks and management and imports, and I'm not the biggest fan of it to date, but I see the value in basically multi-cloud with it, which is definitely a huge win.
Sure. Any other question for John?
Someone's talking. I can't really hear you.
Hey Shiva, you are not audible.
You're able to hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, much better.
Yeah, like I was thinking, this Bicep is it's a compiled language, right? So what I was thinking is, if the number of lines of code in the Bicep increases, the compilation time might also increase. That might be a performance impact.
Yeah, I mean, it could. I don't know. I haven't built anything. I don't know if I haven't built anything that large. I don't know if there are many examples, because I'm guessing to get to that type of performance hit, it's going to be a pretty beefy Bicep file. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure they're out there, because ARM templates have limitations and people hit the ARM template limitations. So it's possible, I would suppose, but I haven't tested that.
Yeah, basically I was thinking of the linked ARM templates links. I mean, we can do a linking of the ARM templates, right? Instead of writing one big ARM template, we can link a sub. So how this is processed in Bicep, that will be a good thing to test it on.
I'm not sure even if Bicep supports linked resource ARM templates today, but yeah, that's a good question, Shiva. Anyone else?
Thanks, John. Thanks for the good session.
Oh, welcome. Well, if you need to get a hold of me, I'll leave this up for a second. Feel free to reach out, or if any questions, any ideas. This stuff's fun to play around with for sure.
Awesome. Thank you, John. I think we started the year with a bang. It was a very good session. I hope everyone would have liked it. On behalf of the user group, I'd like to thank you so much for taking your time and presenting this session. The recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, so for everyone to check it out later. Thanks, John.
Yep, thanks for having me.